Sir, if you just square up to the target like everyone else, we can get started. The voice was young, crisp, and saturated with the kind of unearned confidence that comes from a fresh certification hanging on a wall. It belonged to Kyle, the lead instructor at the civilian marksmanship course, a man whose tactical vest still had the factory stiffness in its seams. He stood with his arms crossed, a caricature of authority, looking down at the old man fumbling with his rifle case. The man, Sam, didn't look up immediately. He seemed more concerned with the worn latches of the case than the instruction being broadcast across the firing line. The sun beat down on the dusty outdoor range, and the air was already thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder and the scent of baked earth. To the other shooters, a mix of weekend enthusiasts and first-timers, Kyle's tone was just part of the expected military-style discipline. But to one observer, a young ROTC cadet named Jenna, who was there for extra practice, it landed with a sour note. She watched the old man finally coax the case open. He moved with a deliberate slowness that could be mistaken for frailty, but there was an economy to it, a lack of any wasted motion that caught her eye. He didn't seem defiant, just occupied by a process that was his and his alone. Sam finally straightened up, his rifle cradled in his arms. It was an older model, a plain AR-15 with none of the expensive optics or flashy accessories that adorned the other weapons on the line. The finish was worn to a dull gray along the receiver and the grip. He gave Kyle a brief, polite nod. "I'm all set," he said, his voice quiet, a low rumble that seemed to get lost in the open air. He moved to his designated spot, his boots scuffing softly on the gravel. He didn't look at the other shooters or the pristine target set up 50 yards away. His eyes did a slow, methodical sweep of the entire range, from the side berms to the backstop, noting the position of the first aid station and the single entry gate. It was a subconscious habit, a ghost of another lifetime, and it went completely unnoticed by the instructors. Kyle sighed, a theatrical display of impatience for his partner, Ben. "All right, folks, listen up. Today we're focusing on fundamentals. That means a proper, stable shooting platform." He shot a pointed look at Sam. "A good stance is the foundation of every accurate shot. Feet shoulder-width apart, weight forward, shoulders squared to the target. It's not complicated." He demonstrated, his body a perfect picture from a training manual. Everyone on the line shuffled their feet, trying to mimic his posture, everyone except Sam. Sam brought the rifle to his shoulder, and the mockery began, not with words, but with shared glances and stifled smirks between Kyle and Ben. Sam's stance was wrong. It was all wrong, according to every book and every course Kyle had ever taken or taught. He wasn't squared up at all. His body was bladed, turned almost sideways to the target, with his support side foot far forward. He was leaning into the rifle, but not in the aggressive, forward-driving posture they taught. It was a lower, more coiled position, as if he were trying to make himself a smaller target. His support arm wasn't extended in a modern C-clamp grip. Instead, his elbow was tucked in tight, his hand gripping the magazine well, a technique that had been dismissed as obsolete for years. It looked awkward, unbalanced, and fundamentally incorrect. Kyle's jaw tightened. This was his range, his class. He had a standard to maintain. He strode down the line, his new boots crunching authoritatively on the gravel, and stopped directly behind Sam. "Sir," he said, the politeness in his voice thin as a razor's edge, "I'm going to need you to correct that stance. You're off balance. You'll have no recoil control, and you're liable to hurt yourself or someone else." Sam didn't turn. His eyes remained downrange. He made a minute adjustment to his grip, his thumb brushing against the safety selector. "I'm comfortable this way," he replied, his voice still maddeningly calm. "I can manage the recoil." From her position 2 lanes down, Jenna watched the exchange. She saw the old man's back, the fabric of his faded plaid shirt pulled taut across his shoulders. He was thin, but there was a density to his frame, a stillness that suggested deep roots. She saw the way his hands held the rifle, not just as a tool, but as an extension of his body. There were pale, crisscrossing scars across his knuckles, the kind that didn't come from a workshop accident. Kyle's face flushed a dull red. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by some old-timer who looked like he'd be more at home in a rocking chair than on a firing range. "This isn't about comfort. It's about safety and effectiveness, Kyle snapped, his voice rising. This is my class, and that is not a safe or effective stance. Fix it, now. For a moment, the entire line was silent, the other shooters glancing nervously between the unmovable old man and the immovable instructor. Sam finally turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Kyle's. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, but they were clear and steady, holding a depth that was unsettling. "It's safe," he said simply, "and it's effective for me." He then turned back to his target, a clear dismissal. The command to fire echoed down the line. A cacophony of sharp cracks filled the air as the other shooters began sending rounds down range. Kyle stood behind Sam, arms crossed, a smug look on his face, waiting for the old man's wild shots to prove him right. He expected the rifle to buck wildly, for the shots to pepper the target at random if they hit it at all. He was ready with an "I told you so." But what he saw made him blink. Sam's rifle didn't buck, it pulsed. With each shot, the muzzle barely rose, settling back onto the target with an almost supernatural speed. There was no wasted motion, no dramatic recoil. It was a closed system of energy, absorbed and redirected by that strange, coiled stance. The shots themselves were methodical. Crack, a pause, crack, a pause, crack. It wasn't the rapid fire of an amateur, but the controlled rhythmic pace of someone who knew the value of each round. When the ceasefire was called and the targets were retrieved, the truth was undeniable. While most shooters had a respectable scatter of holes in the black, Sam's target was different. There were 5 holes, but they were so close together they formed one single ragged tear in the dead center of the bullseye. A grouping so tight it was almost unbelievable. Kyle stared at the target, then back at Sam, his mind refusing to connect the two. It had to be a fluke, a lucky string of shots from a rickety stance. He wouldn't acknowledge it. "All right, reload. We're doing this again," he barked, his voice betraying a new edge of frustration. Ben walked over, a questioning look in his eyes. "That's some lucky shooting, huh?" he murmured to Kyle. Kyle just grunted in response. "Luck runs out." This time, everyone watched the old man. Jenna found herself holding her breath. Sam reloaded with the same unhurried efficiency. He didn't use a fancy mag pouch. He just pulled a fresh magazine from his jacket pocket, the movement smooth and practiced. He settled back into that same bladed, coiled stance. The commands were given, and the range erupted in noise again. And again, Sam's performance was the same. A quiet, methodical rhythm. A rifle that barely moved. And when the targets were checked, another single ragged hole in the center of the bullseye. The whispers started then, rippling down the line. The other shooters, who had initially smirked along with the instructors, were now looking at Sam with a mixture of confusion and awe. This wasn't luck. This was a level of skill none of them possessed. It was the kind of shooting you saw in videos of special forces operators, not from an old man in a plaid shirt. Kyle felt his authority slipping away. The foundation of his expertise, the rigid, by-the-book fundamentals, was being silently dismantled by a quiet old man who refused to listen. He had to reassert control. He needed to prove that his system, the right way, was superior under pressure. "All right, let's pick up the pace," he announced loudly, walking to the center of the line. "We're going to run a failure drill. 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. On my command, you will engage the target as quickly and accurately as possible. Speed and precision. This is where a stable platform is non-negotiable." He looked directly at Sam. "This drill will separate the disciplined shooters from the lucky ones." He ran the drill himself first, a blur of practiced motion. His squared-up stance was aggressive, his movements sharp. The shots were fast, bang, 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 and his hits were decent, all within the vital zones. "That's how it's done," he said, breathing a little heavily. "Speed, stability, accuracy. Now, shooters, on my command." He stood back, his eyes locked on Sam, waiting for the old man's awkward technique to finally fail under the pressure of speed. The command was given. Most shooters fumbled slightly, their rhythm thrown off by the demand for speed. Shots went wider, the headshots missing the mark. Then, it was Sam's turn. He didn't explode into motion like Kyle had. Instead, he seemed to flow. His rifle came up, and the 3 shots were fired in a single seamless action. It wasn't three distinct sounds, but a brutal, stuttering roar. Rap. Rap. The sound was different, faster, more controlled than anyone else's. When he was done, the rifle was already back at a low ready, his eyes scanning, his body perfectly still. There was no fumbling, no frantic energy, just a lethal economy of motion that was both terrifying and beautiful to watch. The silence that followed was heavy. When they checked the target, a collective gasp went through the small crowd. 2 rounds were perfectly centered in the chest box, overlapping. The third was a clean shot directly in the center of the head box. It was faster than Kyle. It was more accurate than Kyle. It was, by every possible metric, perfect. The instructor's entire world, built on manuals and certifications, had just been demolished by a quiet old man and his wrong stance. Kyle's face was a mask of disbelief and wounded pride. He couldn't accept it. He walked down the line and stood in front of Sam, his voice low and tight with fury. "All right, that's enough. Where did you learn to shoot like that? What backwoods, unsafe course taught you that unorthodox garbage?" The other shooters held their breath. The friendly range day had curdled into a tense confrontation. Sam finally lowered his rifle and turned to face the instructor fully. He looked at the young man, at the anger and confusion in his eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than calm patience crossed his face. It might have been sadness, or perhaps just weariness. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet authority he carried was more powerful than any shout. "It's not garbage," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "It's called the Sadr City Stance." The name meant nothing to Kyle or most of the others, but Jenna, the ROTC cadet, felt a jolt of recognition. She'd read about Sadr City in her military history classes. It was a name synonymous with some of the most intense, brutal urban combat of the Iraq War. Sam continued, his gaze distant, as if he were looking at something far beyond the dusty range. "We developed it in the spring of 2004. The Mahdi army was everywhere. The streets were so narrow you could touch the buildings on both sides. We were getting hit from rooftops, from windows, from alleyways, from all three at once." He shifted his feet, sinking back into the stance, and suddenly it no longer looked awkward. It looked purposeful. "If you squared up to a threat in front of you," he explained, tapping his own chest, "you were giving the guy on the roof a perfect, wide-open target of your chest and head. You were exposing all your armor plates to fire from above." He bladed his body again, demonstrating. "But if you turned sideways, you presented the smallest possible target to anyone above you. You gave them nothing but the edge of your helmet and your shoulder plate. It kept your vitals covered." He then pointed his rifle downrange again, tucking his elbow in tight. "And this grip, holding the mag well? We were fighting inside rooms the size of a closet. You couldn't extend your arm without hitting a wall or having your rifle grabbed. You had to keep it in tight, close to your body, so you could pivot and fight in any direction instantly." The range was utterly silent now, save for the whisper of the wind. The sound of distant traffic seemed to fade away. Everyone was captivated, listening to a lesson that hadn't come from a book, but had been written in blood and desperation on the streets of Baghdad. Kyle stood frozen, his own anger draining away, replaced by a dawning, horrifying sense of humility. He was looking at his own reflection in the vast chasm of this man's experience. He had been teaching the rules of a game, while Sam was demonstrating the reality of a war. "The first time my platoon got caught in a 3-way ambush," Sam said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intimate. "We lost 3 men in 30 seconds. They were all shot from above. They did everything right, everything the book told them to do. They squared up to the enemy in front of them, and the snipers on the rooftops took them apart." He paused, and his pale blue eyes seemed to cloud over with the memory. "We were pinned down for 18 hours. We learned to adapt. We started fighting from this stance. It was ugly, it was unbalanced, but it kept us alive. It let us protect our buddies. It gave us a chance to fight back." He finally looked directly at Kyle, his eyes holding no malice, only the profound weight of his history. "That sloppy technique, as you called it, that stance saved my life, and the lives of the 47 men in my company who made it home from that deployment. We didn't learn it in a course. We learned it by watching our friends die." A profound, reverent hush fell over the range. The air, once filled with the crack of rifles and the sting of arrogance, was now thick with respect. Kyle's face had gone pale. The tactical vest, the crisp uniform, the air of authority. It all seemed like a cheap costume in the face of Sam's quiet testimony. He swallowed hard, his own certitude turning to ash in his mouth. He looked at the old man's worn rifle, at the scars on his hands, at the tired lines around his eyes, and for the first time, he saw him. He didn't see an old-timer who didn't know the rules. He saw a warrior who had written them. I'm sorry, Kyle stammered, the words feeling small and inadequate. Sir, I had no idea. I apologize. Ben, his partner, just stood there, shaking his head slowly, his own shame written plainly on his face. He had been complicit in the mockery, and the weight of it was crushing. Sam just gave a small, slow nod of acceptance. There was no triumph in his posture, no hint of, I told you so. There was only a quiet dignity, the same he had carried all day. He had not sought a confrontation. He had simply refused to abandon the technique that had brought his men home. The spell was broken when Jenna, the young cadet, stepped forward. She walked past the humbled instructors and stopped in front of Sam. Her face was a mixture of awe and profound respect. Sir, she said, her voice clear and steady, would you be willing to show me how to do that correctly? Sam looked at her, and a genuine small smile touched his lips for the first time that day. It transformed his face, easing the weary lines. He saw in her the same spark of duty, the same willingness to learn that had defined his own youth. Of course, he said gently. It's not about being fast. It's about being small. And it's about making sure the man next to you is still standing when the shooting stops. Here, let me show you. He began to patiently adjust her stance, his scarred hands guiding her with a gentleness that belied the brutal origins of the lesson. The other shooters gathered around, no longer as students of Kyle, but as silent observers, witnessing a transfer of knowledge, a legacy being passed from one generation to the next. Kyle and Ben stood on the edge of the circle, watching, their own lesson for the day complete. They had learned that the most important fundamentals aren't always found in a manual. Sometimes they are etched into the muscle memory of a quiet old man who had already paid the price for their wisdom.